The silk cord gleamed in the lamplight as it tightened around her throat. Gulbahar Sultan pressed her back against the cold marble wall of the Tower of Justice, a breath coming in shallow gasps as the mute executioner's hands worked with practiced efficiency. The bowstring, that terrible instrument of Ottoman mercy, would leave no mark of violence upon her porcelain skin, no unseemly blood to stain the carpets of the Topkapi Palace. Above her, through the narrow window, she could hear the evening call to prayer drifting across the Golden Horn, the same haunting melody that had once comforted her during her rise from Georgian slave girl to second consort of Sultan Murad IV. The irony was not lost on her. She who had once commanded a household of 300 servants, who had worn robes worth more than entire villages, who had borne the Sultan's son and dreamed of seeing him ascend the throne, she would die as silently as she had been forced to live. No trial, no public accusation, no chance to defend herself against the whispered poison that had reached the Sultan's ear in his private chambers that very morning. Her fingers clawed at the silk, but the cord had been blessed by the palace imam and would not yield. In the corridor beyond, she could hear the soft shuffle of slippers on marble, the other women of the harem being led back to their quarters, their evening meal of honeyed almonds and rosewater waiting on silver trays. They would learn of her fate only through absence, through the gradual realization that her apartment stood empty, her name no longer spoken in the courtyards where gossip once flowed like wine. The bowstring tightened once more, and Gulbahar's vision began to blur. Yet even as darkness crept across her sight, she could still smell the jasmine oil in her hair, still feel the weight of the emerald earrings the Sultan had gifted her on the night their son was conceived. The imperial harem of the Ottoman Empire existed as a world within a world, a universe of whispered secrets and absolute power wrapped in silk and shadow behind the walls of Topkapi Palace. Here, in these labyrinthine chambers overlooking the Bosphorus, the Sultan's women lived according to laws older than memory, their lives governed by rituals that would determine the fate of an empire stretching from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Red Sea. The Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, ruled this feminine empire with iron authority disguised as maternal care. From her apartments decorated with Persian carpets worth kingdoms, and Chinese porcelain that caught the light of 1,000 oil lamps, she orchestrated the delicate ballet of palace life. Each morning, as the muezzin's call echoed across the 7 hills of Constantinople, she would receive reports from her network of servants, eunuchs, and informants. Which concubine had caught the Sultan's eye during the previous evening's entertainment? Which had shown signs of the blessed condition that might produce a male heir, which had grown too bold, too comfortable, too dangerous to the established order? The women themselves moved through this world like pieces on a chessboard, carved from ivory and obsidian. The newest arrivals, Christian girls seized in raids from the Caucasus or purchased in the slave markets of Kaffa, would spend months in the house of instruction, learning the intricate choreography of submission. They learned to walk with heads bowed, to speak only when addressed, to read the Sultan's mood from the set of his shoulders or the rhythm of his breathing. They practiced the 73 positions of pleasure described in the ancient texts, their bodies trained as carefully as any musician's fingers, their minds moulded to anticipate desire before it was even formed. Those who survived this education and found favour would ascend the invisible hierarchy of the harem, from simple odalisque to Guzda, the favoured one whose beauty had caught the Sultan's attention, to Iqbal, the fortunate concubine who shared his bed regularly, and finally, for the truly blessed or cunning, to the rank of Kadin Effendi, an official consort whose children might one day rule the world. Yet beneath this apparent order lay currents of ambition and terror that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. The Ottoman law of fratricide, that ancient custom which decreed that a new sultan must execute all his brothers to prevent civil war, cast its shadow over every pregnancy, every birth, every moment of maternal joy. A concubine who bore a son knew that her child's survival depended not on love or divine favour, but on being the first to reach the throne. All other princes, no matter how young or innocent, would face the bowstring or the blade. The women learned to read omens in the pattern of coffee grounds at the bottom of their cups, in the flight of birds across the palace gardens, in the quality of silence that preceded the Sultan's footsteps in the corridor. They developed their own language of survival, a glance that warned of the chief eunuch's approach, a gesture that indicated which servant could be trusted with a message, a particular way of arranging the folds of a veil that signalled alliance or enmity. The palace itself seemed designed to amplify these psychological pressures. The women's quarters sprawled across courtyards and terraces, with rooms leading into rooms in an endless maze of interconnected spaces. Windows were barred with intricate metalwork that created beautiful shadows while ensuring that no woman could escape, and no unauthorized male eye could glimpse the treasures within. The walls were thick enough to muffle screams, the doors heavy enough to seal away secrets that could topple dynasties. In the evenings, when the Sultan held court in the Chamber of Petitions or met with his Grand Vizier to discuss the affairs of empire, the women would gather in the Hall of the Fountain. Here, beneath a dome painted with verses from the Quran in flowing calligraphy, they would embroider, play chess, or listen to musicians whose voices had been trained to pierce the heart without disturbing the peace. Yet even these moments of apparent tranquility were performances, each woman aware that she was being watched, evaluated, judged by standards that shifted like sand in the desert wind. The most successful concubines understood that their true power lay not in their beauty, which would fade, but in their ability to become indispensable to the complex emotional and political needs of their master. They became experts in the art of conversation, able to discuss poetry and philosophy as easily as they could demonstrate new techniques of pleasure. They cultivated relationships with the palace's vast network of servants, eunuchs and officials, building webs of loyalty and information that extended far beyond the harem walls. The ritual began at midnight, when even the palace guards had settled into the drowsy rhythm of the late watch. Deep beneath the marble floors of the Sultan's private quarters, in chambers that appeared on no architectural plans, the Valide Sultan would descend stone steps worn smooth by centuries of forbidden footsteps. The air grew thick with the smoke of burning amber and frankincense, oils imported from the farthest reaches of the empire, specifically for these nocturnal ceremonies that predated Islam itself. Here, in the forgotten heart of the palace, the Ottoman court practiced rites that would have horrified the pious scholars of the mosque and delighted the ancient shamans of Central Asia. The night of selection occurred whenever the Sultan showed signs of losing interest in his current favourites, or when political necessity demanded new blood in the imperial line. The Valide Sultan, keeper of traditions that stretched back to the tent courts of the steppes, would personally oversee the choosing of which women would be offered to darker powers in exchange for the Sultan's renewed passion. The selected concubines, always those who had grown too confident, too outspoken, or simply too familiar to maintain the Sultan's attention, would be led blindfolded through secret passages that connected every major chamber in Topkapi. They believed they were being taken to a special audience, perhaps to receive gifts or appointments to higher rank. The chief black eunuch, whose voice had been stolen by the knife but whose loyalty had been purchased with gold beyond counting, would guide them with gentle touches on their shoulders, his massive hands surprisingly tender as he steered them toward their fate. In the underground chamber, lit only by oil lamps whose flames reflected off polished obsidian walls, the women would find themselves in a space that seemed to exist outside time itself. Ancient symbols carved into the stone, not Arabic script, but older markings that spoke of spirits that ruled before the Prophet brought his message to the Arabian. Desert covered every surface. The floor was a mosaic depicting creatures that belonged neither to earth nor heaven, their eyes made of precious stones that seemed to watch and judge the living. The Valide Sultan would appear dressed not in her usual Ottoman robes, but in ceremonial garments that recalled the shamanic traditions of the Turkic peoples. Her headdress bore the wings of eagles killed on the shores of the Aral Sea. Her arms were painted with henna in patterns that mimicked the ritual scarification of her ancestors. She spoke words in the old Turkic tongue, calling upon spirits whose names had been whispered around campfires long before Constantinople was even imagined. The concubines, still blindfolded, would be arranged in a circle around a brass basin filled with water from the sacred spring of Zemzem, secretly transported from Mecca at enormous risk and expense. Into this water, the Valide Sultan would drop objects of power, a lock of hair from each woman, nail clippings taken while they slept, threads from the robes they wore during their most intimate moments with the Sultan. The water would begin to steam without any visible source of heat, and shapes would appear in its surface that seemed to move with purpose. What followed was a ceremony of transference, in which the life force and beauty of the chosen women would be ritually extracted and concentrated into talismans designed to renew the Sultan's desire. The process required the women to remain conscious throughout, their terror and confusion serving as essential components in the ancient formula. They would be forced to drink wine mixed with powders ground from stones found only in the caves beneath Mount Ararat, substances that would heighten their sensitivity while preventing them from crying out or struggling. As the ritual reached its climax, the Valide Sultan would place her hands upon each woman's face, her fingers tracing patterns across their foreheads, while she chanted invocations that seemed to pull the very breath from their lungs. The concubines would feel their strength ebbing away, their beauty literally being drawn out of them like silk thread from a cocoon. Their hair would begin to lose its luster, their skin would grow pale and drawn, their eyes would dim as if a flame inside them was slowly being extinguished. The extracted essence would be channeled into amulets and oils that would later be used to anoint the Sultan's food, his bedsheets, his favourite pipes for smoking tobacco. He would never know the true source of his renewed vigour and passion, attributing it to the natural restorative powers of youth and power. Meanwhile, the women who had undergone the ritual would be left as hollow shells of their former selves, their minds intact, but their bodies drained of the vital spark that had once made them irresistible. These depleted concubines would be quietly moved to the furthest quarters of the harem, officially designated as servants, but actually serving as living reminders to the other women of what happened to those who forgot their place. They would continue to live for months or even years, but as shadows of themselves, their former beauty replaced by a haunting fragility that served as both warning and punishment to any who might consider challenging the established order. The first sign that the old order was crumbling came with the screams that echoed through the harem quarters on an October morning in 1648. Harem Sultan, the most powerful Valide in Ottoman history, lay sprawled across the Persian carpets of her private chamber, her throat bearing the unmistakable marks of the bowstring. The woman who had ruled the empire from behind a latticed screen for nearly 3 decades, who had orchestrated the rise and fall of sultans as easily as arranging flowers, had finally fallen victim to the very forces she had spent her life manipulating. Her murderers were not foreign assassins or rebellious janissaries, but her own daughter-in-law Turhan Sultan, along with a cadre of eunuchs who had grown tired of the ancient ways. They had crept through the secret passages that Harem herself had once used to dispose of rivals, turning the palace's hidden arteries against their former mistress. The ritual chamber beneath the Sultan's quarters was sealed with blocks of stone that same night, its entrance obliterated as if it had never existed. Word of the Valide's death spread through the harem with the speed of plague, carrying with it whispers of the forbidden ceremonies that had died with her. The women who had survived the night of selection found their voices returning, as if released from some terrible enchantment, though what they remembered would haunt their dreams for the remainder of their shortened lives. They spoke in hushed tones of the underground chamber, of the obsidian walls that had reflected their terror, of the sensation of having their very souls drawn from their bodies like water from a well. Turhan Sultan, now the new Valide, moved swiftly to consolidate her power and distance herself from her predecessors' practices. She ordered the execution of the chief black eunuch, the only man who possessed complete knowledge of Harem's rituals, having him strangled in the same manner as his former mistress. The talismans and oils that had been used to maintain the Sultan's desire were quietly destroyed, their ashes scattered into the Bosphorus during the dark hours before dawn. Yet the damage to the harem's delicate ecosystem had already been done. Without the mystical reinforcement that had artificially sustained the Sultan's passion, Mehmed IV began to lose interest in his women entirely, spending more time in the company of his hunting falcons than in the perfumed chambers of his concubines. The careful hierarchy that had maintained order for centuries began to collapse as women competed desperately for the attention of a ruler who seemed to have forgotten their existence entirely. The formerly depleted concubines, those hollow shells who had served as warnings to others, began to experience a gradual restoration of their vitality. It was as if the breaking of the ritual's power had allowed their stolen essence to return to them like scattered mercury reforming into a single pool. However, this recovery came at a terrible psychological cost. They remembered everything that had been done to them with crystalline clarity, and their nights became symphonies of screaming that echoed through the marble corridors. Madness spread through the harem like contagion. Women who had once moved with the fluid grace of trained dancers now cowered in corners, their eyes darting constantly toward shadows that seemed to move with malevolent purpose. They reported seeing Ottoman Sultan's ghost in the reflection of polished brass mirrors, her spectral fingers still tracing the ritual patterns that had once drained their life force. Several threw themselves from the windows of the Tower of Justice, preferring the honest brutality of broken stone to the memories that clawed at their sanity. The palace physicians, those learned men who had studied in the medical schools of Damascus and Cairo, found themselves helpless before ailments that had no physical cause. They prescribed treatments of rosewater and honey, of bloodletting and purification, but their remedies were as useless as prayers whispered to deaf gods. The women's bodies were healing, but their spirits remained shattered by experiences that existed outside the natural order of creation. The surviving eunuchs, those guardians who had maintained the harem's secrets for generations, began to speak of curses that would pursue the Ottoman line through all its remaining years. They claimed that the violent end of the ancient rituals had torn a hole in the fabric of destiny itself, creating a wound through which misfortune would flow like poisoned water. Their prophecies seemed to manifest with disturbing accuracy. Military defeats in Europe, rebellions in the provinces, financial crises that drained the imperial treasury. In the city beyond the palace walls, rumours began to circulate among the coffee houses and bazaars. Merchants spoke of strange dreams that visited them after trading with palace officials, visions of underground chambers where women's souls were harvested like grain at harvest time. The Janissaries whispered of supernatural forces that had once protected the empire, but had now withdrawn their favour, leaving the Sultan vulnerable to enemies both mortal and divine. The new Valide Sultan, despite her apparent victory, found herself trapped in a palace that felt more like a mausoleum than a seat of power. The weight of the secrets she had helped destroy pressed upon her consciousness like a stone upon the chest of a drowning man. She could feel the reproachful gaze of the depleted women whenever she walked the corridors, and at night she would wake to find her pillows damp with tears she could not remember shedding. In the winter of 1687, as snow fell silently upon the domes of Topkapi Palace, the last keeper of the ancient secrets took her final breath in a chamber that had once housed 100 concubines, but now echoed with emptiness. Gulnash Sultan had been barely 14 when she witnessed Qasem's murder, barely 20 when she bore the future Sultan Mustafa II, and now, at 43, she carried within her failing body the weight of knowledge that no living soul would inherit. The ritual chamber beneath the palace had been sealed for nearly 40 years, its entrance buried under layers of marble and mortar that succeeding generations of palace architects believed was merely structural reinforcement. Yet sometimes, in the deepest hours of winter nights, when the wind howled across the Bosphorus and rattled the ancient windows of the harem, servants would report hearing sounds from below. Not voices exactly, but something that resembled weeping, or perhaps the echo of prayers, spoken in a language that predated memory. Gulnash had spent decades attempting to reconstruct the forbidden rituals from fragments of memory and whispered confessions extracted from the few remaining witnesses. She believed, with the fervour of the truly desperate, that the empire's decline, the loss of Hungary, the failed siege of Vienna, the growing boldness of European powers, was directly connected to the severing of the mystical bonds that had once sustained Ottoman power. In her private chambers, hidden behind false walls that she had commissioned during her years as Valide Sultan, she had assembled a collection of artifacts that might have allowed her to restore the ancient ceremonies. There were bottles of water from the Zemzem well, smuggled from Mecca at enormous risk and expense. Stones carved with pre-Islamic symbols, purchased from Bedouin traders who claimed they came from the ruins of cities destroyed before the time of Abraham. Locks of hair from dozens of concubines, collected over the years by servants who believed they were gathering components for love potions or protective charms. Most precious of all was a manuscript, written in the archaic Turkic script, supposedly dictated by a shaman who had served the grandfather of Osman I himself. the original founder of the dynasty. Yet Gulnush had never dared to attempt the rituals, paralysed by the knowledge of what had happened to Qasem Sultan, and haunted by dreams in which the murdered Valide appeared with eyes like burning coals, warning her against awakening powers that had chosen to slumber. The empire continued its slow decline, each military defeat and diplomatic humiliation seeming to confirm that the old sources of strength had been permanently severed. As she lay dying, surrounded by physicians who spoke in hushed tones of humoral imbalances and corruption of the blood, Gulnush could hear footsteps in the corridor outside her chamber. Footsteps that belonged to no living person, moving with the distinctive shuffle of someone wearing the heavy ceremonial robes that had been buried with Qasem Sultan decades earlier. The sound would pause outside her door for exactly 13 heartbeats, then continue down the hallway toward chambers that had stood empty since the Great Purge of 1648. Her final act was to summon her most trusted eunuch, a man who had served 3 sultans, and whose loyalty had been tested by bribes that could have purchased entire provinces. With hands that trembled from more than physical weakness, she pressed into his palm a key made of black iron, its head carved with symbols that hurt the eyes to look upon directly. She whispered instructions that made him recoil in horror, then made him swear an oath that bound him to silence until his own death. The eunuch would carry that key for the remaining 12 years of his life, never speaking of his burden but never able to forget the weight of it against his palm. He would wake each morning knowing that somewhere beneath the palace, sealed behind walls that grew thicker with each passing year, lay secrets that could restore an empire or destroy what remained of it. The choice between power and safety, between the old ways and the new order, would die with him as it had died with Gulnush Sultan. In the decades that followed, as the Ottoman Empire continued its inexorable transformation from medieval theocracy to modern state, the palace itself began to change around the buried secret. Rooms were renovated, walls were moved, entire sections were rebuilt according to European architectural principles that had no understanding of the mystical geography that had once governed the structure's design. Yet somehow, through all these modifications, the sealed chamber remained undisturbed, as if the very stones conspired to protect what lay hidden beneath. The question that haunts historians even today is whether those ancient rituals, with their terrible cost in human suffering, had actually sustained the empire's power for 6 centuries, or whether their perceived effectiveness was merely coincidence masquerading as causation. Did Qasem Sultan's death truly rob the Ottomans of their supernatural advantage, or was the empire's decline the inevitable result of changing times and shifting balances of power? Perhaps more disturbing is the possibility that the rituals continue even now, in some form adapted to modern circumstances, their practitioners hidden within institutions that present respectable faces to the contemporary world, while maintaining traditions that stretch back to the shamanic cults of the Asian steppes. Somewhere beneath Istanbul, in spaces that appear on no map and are known to no living architect, the obsidian walls still reflect images of things that should not be, and the brass basin still holds water that steams without heat, waiting for hands that remember the old gestures and voices that recall the ancient words